والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم وبعد. So inshallah bi'idhnillah, to continue with the Kitab al-Salah of Al-Ihya by Hujjatul Islam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali rahmatullahi alayh. And we previously looked at al-Qiyam and al-Qira'ah, and now we have come to al-Ruku' wa lawahiquhu, and then al-Sujud, and then inshallah al-Tashahud. And so we mentioned that in this particular section of the book, Imam al-Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala, he's speaking about the fiqh of salah, etc. But he's touching upon areas that won't necessarily be touched upon in the books of fiqh. And of course, there are going to be other sections that come after that focus more on issues which are relevant to the heart and the soul, which is the purpose of this lesson, the cleansing of the heart, the soul, character, etc. And so he says, rahimahullah, al-ruku'u wa lawahiquhu. So al-ruku', so the bowing in the salah and that which relates to it. ثم يركع ويراعي فيه أمورا وهو أن يكبر للركوع وأن يرفع يديه مع تكبيرة الركوع. So he says, after we spoke about the qira'ah, so let's quickly just go through it again. The standing, the takbir, the dua al-istiftah, the intention, and being wary of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, trying to have some khushu', etc. And then we spoke about the qira'ah, so recitation of Fatiha, and we mentioned بتشديداتها وبتشديداتها وبحروفها, and we said it's very important that a person focuses on learning how to recite the Quran properly, as it's the first thing that will be asked about on Yawm al-Qiyamah, the Salah. And so the one who cannot recite Fatiha correctly, the Salah is potentially not going to be accepted from them. And there are opportunities for everyone today to learn how to recite the Quran properly, or at least develop a proficiency in the recitation of the Quran. There's no excuse for anyone, basically. We discussed this last week. And then we're going to speak about now the bowing, al-ruku'. He says, ثُمَّ يَرْكَعُ وَيُرَاعِي فِيهِ أُمُورًا. So after the recitation, after a person has recited Surah Al-Fatiha and 3 ayat or a surah equivalent to 3 ayat, etc., after Al-Fatiha, the person is going to bow. He says, whilst bowing, he needs to take into consideration or be conscious of a few things. Number one, وَهُوَ أَن يُكَبِّرَ لِلرُّكُوعِ, that he engages in the takbir. So the first takbir of ruku', some of the fuqaha, they refer to it as takbirat al-intiqal, the takbir of going from one state of salah into another state of salah. So from standing to bowing, bowing to, or back to bowing, and standing, and then standing to prostrating, etc. So to remember, to mention, to pronounce the takbir. وَأَن يَرْفَعَ يَدَيْهِ مَعَ تَكْبِيرَةِ الرُّكُوعِ. And as we said last week, this is in accordance to the Shafi'i school of fiqh. And so he says, and to raise the hands when initiating the Allahu Akbar. So when a person is going to go into ruku', based upon the Shafi'i school and the Hanbali school, they should raise their hands when they pronounce the Allahu Akbar. According to the Hanafi school, there is no raising of the hands. The only time you raise the hands in the Hanafi school is for the initial takbirah, takbiratul ihram. So other than that, you wouldn't raise the hands. And we said last week, whichever madhab a person follows, they're following the Quran and the Sunnah. There's no issue there. By consensus of the ulama, there is a consensus of the scholars of Islam that a person can follow any of the 4 schools of fiqh. And if a person were to say that it's not permissible to follow a madhab, they are going against the consensus of the ulama that came before us. The likes of Ibn Rajab, Ibn al-Qayyim, Ibn Taymiyyah, from the Hanabila, for example, as often today individuals like to quote some of the famous Hanbali scholars and suggest that they were against following a madhab, etc. It's not the case. Ibn Rajab, for example, he authored an entire book on why it is compulsory for a person to follow a madhab. And I'm personally not suggesting that, and even if I did, it means nothing anyway if I were to suggest something. But the point is, following a madhab is important. Why? So that you know how to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. To follow a madhab is basically to learn how to worship Allah based upon the Quran and the Sunnah as understood by the Sahaba and then formulated for us by the scholars that came after the Sahaba. That's all it is. And so if you follow the Shafi'i madhab, raise your hands. If you follow the Hanbali madhab, raise your hands. If you follow the Hanafi madhab, don't raise your hands. The most important point is, whichever madhab we follow, connect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's the most important point. And he says, وَأَن يَمُدَّ التَّكْبِيرَ مَدًّا إِلَى الْإِنْتِهَاءِ إِلَى الرُّكُوعِ. So the person, when bowing, they should initiate the Allahu Akbar as they begin to bow, and it should continue until they reach the final position of the bowing state. So it should be Allahu Akbar. And we can go into certain issues about this, etc. But the point is not a lesson in fiqh. And so we're not going to go into too much detail. But if a person were to say Allahu Akbar and then go down, or go down and say Allahu Akbar, or they would say Allahu Akbar, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept it from them. That's all we do. We ask Allah to accept it from them. When a person is leading the salah, it's better that they don't say Allahu Akbar and then go down. Why? Because if you start with Allahu Akbar and then go down, those who are behind you may end up performing ruku' before you, which is problematic. And so you want to try to initiate it at least as you're on your way down. At least try to initiate it so that by the time you're finished, you're either halfway through or you're at the final position that you would be standing in, etc. And the reason I say if they don't do that, if a person doesn't do that, may Allah accept it from them, because sometimes you may find an Imam who might say Allahu Akbar and then bow, etc. And we're not here to cause division or to go into masajid and start saying you're not praying correctly and your salah is not correct, etc. No, we're focusing on ourselves. And for an Imam, they should study how to lead salah. Fiqh of salah is very important for an Imam. The fuqaha, they mention if a person has memorized the Quran and they are a qari, a master in their recitation, but they do not understand the fiqh of salah, or there is someone who has more understanding of the fiqh of salah, then the person with the fiqh of salah should lead the qari, the imam, the reciter of the Quran. Just because a person has memorized the Quran, it does not make them a scholar. Likewise, just because a person has memorized hadith, it doesn't make them a scholar. A person may sound like a scholar, but it doesn't mean they are a scholar. And so, again, following a madhab, it rids us of this issue. When a person studies a madhab, understands a madhab, they can worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with some contentment that their salah is correct. And as they traverse the path of learning, etc., they may change their opinions here and there later on, once they have the foundations down. But that shouldn't be the case initially. Then he says, وَأَنْ يَضَعَ رَاحَتَيْهِ عَلَى رُكْبَتَيْهِ فِي الرُّكُوعِ وَأَصَابِعَهُ مَنْشُورَةً عَلَى طُولِ السَّاقِ. So when the person is now in the state of bowing, where do they place their hands? So the palm of the hand should be on the knees. Some of the fuqaha, they'll say the fingers should be together like that on the knees. Others will say the fingers should be spread apart, wrapped around the knees, depending on the madhab which is followed. And again, here we're not focusing on the intricacies, we're focusing on connecting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so we want to focus on bowing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to be in a humble state. As we mentioned last week, some of the fuqaha, they say if a person cannot stand or cannot perform the sujood, they don't have to stand, according to some of the fuqaha. Why? Because the standing is there for the sake of prostrating. The whole point of the salah, the purpose behind the prayer, is to connect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to humble ourselves in the salah for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's sake, not to be arguing and bickering about how and when and what, etc. Then he says, rahimahullah, وَأَن يَنْصِبَ رُكْبَتَيْهِ وَأَن يَمُدَّ ظَهْرَهُ مُسْتَوِيًا وَأَن يَكُونَ عُنُقُهُ وَرَأْسُهُ مُسْتَوِيَيْنِ مَعَ ظَهْرِهِ. So a person should straighten the legs. And this is an issue that many brothers fall into, unfortunately, because they try to straighten their back, and in doing so, they bend their knees because they cannot naturally straighten their back. The point is not, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not judging our salah based upon the angles of our prostration and our bowing, etc. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala judges our salah on the khushu'. So if I bow down and I cannot bend my back beyond a certain place, I shouldn't bend my knees to straighten my back further, because then I'm doing something which the Prophet ﷺ didn't do, which is bending the knees. The knees and the legs should be straight, and my back should be straight to the best of my ability. فَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُمْ. It's fear Allah to the best of your ability. As we said last week about a brother who was told you need to face the Qibla with your feet, etc. If I cannot stand, do I force myself to stand? Of course not. The Prophet ﷺ said, if you cannot stand in prayer, then sit. If you cannot sit, then lay down. So you pray to the best of your ability. And if you cannot bow properly because you have a back problem, perhaps you have a stiff back, perhaps you need to stretch or something like that, then you keep your legs straight regardless. And then he says, وَيَكُونْ عُنُقُهُ وَرَأْسُهُ مُسْتَوِيَيْنِ مَعَ ظَهْرِ. And basically his neck and his head should be level with his back. So a person shouldn't be putting their head down whilst they're in ruku', nor should they be lifting their head up. Their head and neck should be level with their back. لا يكون رأسه أخفض ولا أرفع وأن يجافي مرفقيه عن جنبيه وتضم المرأة مرفقيها إلى جنبيها. So we mentioned last week that the asl for the woman in the Sharia is as-satar. That's the principle, the governing principle in Islam, that a woman conceals herself. And it's better for a woman to conceal herself. And you can apply that in all areas of the woman's life, her body, her voice, etc., etc. So for example, you'll find that a woman shouldn't raise her voice. Why? Because her voice is, according to some of the fuqaha, considered to be awra. And even if it's not considered to be awra, the woman, she embodies modesty. Her embodiment is modesty. That's the nature upon which Allah has created a woman. A woman is naturally modest, whereas the man has been created in the opposite fashion. A man is naturally boisterous and naturally loud, and a man has to learn how to be quiet, etc. It's not say that some men are not going to be quiet. Yes, there are some men that are quiet, but generally the nature of man is that he's loud, he's proud, etc. And the nature of woman is that she's soft and she's moderate, and she should be anyway. And so this should be something which is found in all aspects of the application of the deen. So a man will spread his arms in ruku' and sujood, but a woman brings her arms in. Likewise, someone asked, does the woman spread herself in prostration? And the answer was no. The woman, she tucks her stomach into her thighs, whereas the man spreads his body, so he separates between his stomach and his thighs. So all of this is in relation to the man. As for the woman, she brings herself in. So she brings herself in. وَأَن يَقُولَ سُبْحَانَ رَبِّيَ الْعَظِيمِ ثَلَاثًا. And a person should say, whilst in the state of ruku', bowing, Subhana Rabbi al-Azim 3 times. And there is a challenge for us in our time today. In our time today, we have to try to recognize that which goes against the norms of, or what used to be considered universally agreed upon by man, number one. And number two, that which goes against the framework of Islam. And so today, you may find that a woman is as loud as a man. You may find. But if you look historically, it goes against that which was universally agreed upon, that a woman is not supposed to be loud like a man. Likewise, if you look at the framework of Islam, the woman is not supposed to be loud like a man. At the same time, if you look today, you will find that a man is as soft as a woman. And that goes against what was universally agreed upon previously, and which we spoke about, where the man is not supposed to be soft like the woman. There's supposed to be some coarseness to a man. There's supposed to be the ability to forbear. And as we mentioned when we were speaking about appearance, the fuqaha, they say it's recommended for the man to cream or oil himself ghibban, occasionally, not daily, not 3 times a day, etc. Whereas today you find now men have as many products for skin and hair, etc., as women. And so we have to identify that which is not correct that which goes against the nature of being a man, and that which goes against the nature of being a woman. And we can find this by looking at history, and we can find this even more clearly if we understand the framework of Islam. And we shouldn't be embarrassed or ashamed to say these things. Alhamdulillah, in Islam, the man is clear and the woman is clear. A man is a man and a woman is a woman. And if a man tries to act like a woman, it's a problem. And if a woman tries to act like a man, it's a problem. That's the framework of Islam. And from Islam, from the Aqeedah of Islam, is to accept the framework given to us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to accept it, even if initially we don't like it. So in the khutbah today, for example, the Prophet ﷺ, he said, كَفَى لِلْمَرْءِ إِثْمًا أَن يُضَيِّقَ مَن يَقُوتُ. It's enough of a sin for a man to neglect those whom he has been given responsibility over. Who has been given responsibility in the household? We spoke about this previously. The man. الرِّجَالُ قَوَّامُونَ عَلَى النِّسَاءِ. And so we mentioned the man is going to be held responsible for the well-being of his wife, of his children, more so than the woman. The woman's not going to be asked about whether or not her husband was eating, whereas the man is going to be asked whether or not his wife was eating. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has defined that for us. And so we have to accept that. And so likewise, when it comes to our nature, if you look at the wives of the Prophet ﷺ, they were the best of examples for women. If you look at the men, the Sahaba and the Prophet ﷺ himself, they were the best of examples for men. And so we have to understand the nature that Allah has created us upon. And if we look at society today, these things are up in the air and it's questionable, etc., because they don't believe in a creator. It's a philosophy which stems from a lack of belief in a creator. If you don't believe that something has been created for a purpose, then it can be anything it wants to be. If you believe that something came from nothing, then something can always go back to being nothing, or it can change into something else. Whereas for us, no, we have a purpose. Allah has created man for a purpose. Allah has, when I say man, I mean mankind. Even the animals, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created them for a purpose. That which we have on this earth, Allah has created it for a purpose. And so we have to understand everything's purpose so that we can utilize it, including ourselves. Then he says, ثم يرتفع من الركوع إلى القيام ويرفع يديه ويقول سمع الله لمن حمده ويطمئن في الاعتدال ويقول ربنا لك الحمد. So when the person is now bowing, he raises up from bowing, and he remains in a position of standing. And whilst doing that, he has something which is called طمأنينة. طمأنينة in the salah. Some of the fuqaha consider it to be a wajib. So if you don't have طمأنينة in your salah could be invalid. What is طمأنينة? That you pause at every part of the salah, every part of the prayer. So standing, bowing, prostrating. You pause enough that you can engage in the dhikr of that particular place of the prayer. And if you don't do this, then some of the fuqaha, they will say that you have left off a wajib, and your salah is invalid. And so it's very important that we don't rush through the salah, and we give the salah its right, and we take our time, etc. And he says, وَيَرْفَعُ يَدَيْهِ, he raises his hand when he gets up from bowing into standing, he raises his hand. And we mentioned again, according to the Shafi'i madhab, وَيَقُولُ سَمِعَ اللَّهُ لِمَنْ حَمِدَ, and he says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hears the one who praises him. سَمِعَ اللَّهُ لِمَنْ حَمِدَ, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hears the one who praises him, who calls upon him. And then after سَمِعَ اللَّهُ لِمَنْ حَمِدَ, for those who are behind the Imam, they'll say رَبَّنَا لَكَ الْحَمْدِ, and if he's leading himself, he'll say after he says سَمِعَ اللَّهُ لِمَنْ حَمِدَ. And likewise, if he's an Imam, he can say it after سَمِعَ اللَّهُ لِمَنْ حَمِدَ anyway. رَبَّنَا لَكَ الْحَمْدِ, O Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to you belongs all praise, مِلْءَ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَمِلْءَ الْأَرْضِ وَمِلْءَ مَا شِئْتَ مِنْ شَيْءٍ بَعْدِ. And then he says ثُمَّ يَهْوِي إِلَى السُّجُودِ مُكَبِّرًا. So after he has stood, then he's bowed, he gets back up to stand again, and then he goes into prostration. فَيَضَعُ رُكْبَتَيْهِ عَلَى الْأَرْضِ, and he does so in a state of takbir. And just as we said, when going from standing to bowing, the takbir has to be initiated in the action, so Allahu Akbar. Likewise, from standing to prostrating, Allahu Akbar. So if it's possible, it starts at the beginning of the beginning of the initiation of the action, and it ends when a person arrives at the floor, if it's possible. Then he says, فَيَضَعُ رُكْبَتَيْهِ عَلَى الْأَرْضِ وَيَضَعُ جَبْهَتَهُ وَأَنْفَهُ وَكَفَّيْهِ مَكْشُوفَةً. So he places his knees on the ground, and then his hands, and then his jabha, which is the forehead, and his nose. And there is a hadith, the Prophet ﷺ, he mentioned that a person should prostrate upon 7 parts of the body: the forehead, the nose, so the bridge of the nose, the palms, the knees, and the toes. And there's a difference of opinion. If a person performs sujood without having the forehead and the nose on the floor, is it accepted or not? So some of the fuqaha, they'll say it's not accepted. Some of the fuqaha, they'll say it's accepted, but it's disliked. And so we should always try to have the forehead and the bridge of the nose on the floor when prostrating. And we mentioned last week that this is the closest time a person is to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so when we pray and we go into sujood, it's a time for asking, a time for praising, a time for being with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in that time, we should remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, وَإِذَا سَأَلَكَ عِبَادِي عَنِّي فَإِنِّي قَرِيبٌ أُجِيبُ دَعْوَةَ الدَّاعِ إِذَا دَعَانِ. If my servants ask about me, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then I am close, I answer the dua of those who call upon me. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions unconditionally that Allah answers the dua of those who call upon Him unconditionally, to the extent, as we know, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will even answer the dua of the non-Muslim. The non-Muslim who's in trouble and in danger and fears death and calls upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah will answer their dua as a test for them. And so when we go into sujood, we should ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we don't ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala based upon our actions. We don't ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because we deserve His mercy. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because He is Ar-Rahman, because He loves to give, because He's waiting to hear from us. And so if I go into sujood and I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because I know that He is Ar-Rahman, that gives me confidence in asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Even if I'm in a state of sin, even if I feel I don't deserve anything from Him, etc. And that's how we should turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We turn to Allah in a state of wanting and confidence that Allah will give. And then he says, وَلَا يَرْفَعُ يَدَيْهِ فِي غَيْرِ الرُّكُوعِ. So again, we're not going to go into these issues. وَيَكُونُ أَوَّلُ مَا يَقَعَ مِنْهُ عَلَى الْأَرْضِ رُكْبَتَاهُ ثُمَّ يَدَاهُ ثُمَّ وَجْهَهُ. And he says the first thing that should be placed on the ground when he goes into sujood is the knees, and then the hands, and then the forehead. But again, there's difference of opinion in this issue, and this became a big issue of contention, where you had individuals arguing and accusing each other of not following the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, which is ridiculous. They're both, if you place your hands first or your knees first, you're following the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. You're following the Prophet ﷺ, and his sunnah is to pray. His sunnah is to offer a prayer. You're following that sunnah. And the differences of opinion are due to the differences between the Sahaba. And the differences between the Sahaba are due to various reasons. And the Prophet ﷺ, he said, إِنَّ أَصْحَابِكَ النُّجُومِ بِأَيِّهِمْ اقْتَدَيْتُمْ اهْتَدَيْتُمْ. أو كما قال عليه الصلاة والسلام. He said, my companions are like the stars. Whichever of them you follow, you will find guidance. When lost at night, if you can find one star and you know that particular star and you use it to navigate, you'll find that which you're looking for. Likewise, the Sahaba, if you follow any of the Sahaba, then you are following guidance. And so regardless of which particular opinion of the Sahaba you're following the guided way, as they took it from the Prophet ﷺ. And that's what the 4 schools are. The 4 schools, their differences stem from the differences between the Sahaba. And there are reasons for the differences of the Sahaba. For example, some of them meeting the Prophet ﷺ at different periods of his life. It could be their own interpretation. Aisha radiallahu anha, she was known to have a different interpretation of certain ahadith compared to others. And for us, it's not a concern. For us, we should concern ourselves with following the Prophet ﷺ. And in our time today, and this is something to really reflect upon, in our time today, if a person is following Islam with mistakes, it's far, far better than not following Islam at all. And it's something to consider when we talk about other masajid. We talk about other people. This person is going to this masjid or listening to this imam or listening to this da'i, etc. And we might, want to warn them, or might say, no, you shouldn't go to that masjid. Let them go to the masjid, even if the masjid has mistakes. going to the masjid with mistakes is better than not going to a masjid at all. And for us, if our children come home, for example, they say, I want to follow a particular strand of Islam, and we believe that that particular strand of Islam has certain mistakes in it, we should say Alhamdulillah. Why? Because they want to follow Islam. Mistakes can always be worked on. They can be discussed. They can be understood. There's ground for reasoning. But as for saying, no, don't follow these people, and cutting them off, etc., you're potentially cutting them off from goodness. If we look at an individual that calls people to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we say he calls people to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but he has particular mistakes in a certain aspect of his Islam, and people are coming to Islam through him. If we cut him off, we're cutting people off from coming to Islam. And so what's better for them? To come to Islam with certain mistakes, or to remain upon disbelief? Which is better? Of course, to come to Islam with mistakes. We have to recognize the time that we're in. We have to understand the time that we're in. And if you look at some of the greatest of scholars of the past, some of them had mistakes according to the perspective of their opponents, theological opponents, fiqhi opponents, etc. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have respect. We live in a time which is very difficult. And we live in a time that we have not seen its like. And so mistakes are going to be made. It's a given. Anyone who pioneers, they are going to make mistakes along the way. Otherwise, they wouldn't be a pioneer. And so we have to understand these issues for what they are, and especially issues such as this, placing the knees before the hands, hands before the knees. And for someone, maybe he has a back problem, so he places hands first. No problem. Whatever you feel comfortable with, whatever is natural to you, as long as there is an opinion that allows for it, and you're not adding something to the salah. The point of the salah is what? To connect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's not a mathematical equation. We do not have to have 90-degree angles and 180-degree angles throughout the salah, etc. It's not a maths equation. It's worship. And it shouldn't be made into a maths equation. Then he says, ويجافي مرفقيه عن جنبيه ولا تفعل المرأة ذلك ويفرج بين رجليه ولا تفعل المرأة ذلك. And whilst in sujood, he will extend his arms so that there is a gap between his arms and his sides. Likewise, he will leave a gap between his feet. So his feet will be separated, not together. And again, this is a difference of opinion. Some say bring the feet together, some say separate. But what is important, he says, وَلَا تَفْعَلُ الْمَرْأَةُ ذَلِكَ, both times. So the lady, she does not separate her arms from her body. She brings her arms in. She does not separate her feet from each other. She brings her feet together. Why? Because al-aslu fil mar'ati as-satru. That's the default state for the woman, to conceal herself, as Allah has made her beautiful. Allah has created the woman beautiful. And so she, with, as they say, with great power is great responsibility, and beauty is a power. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given them that responsibility. Allah has given them the responsibility of being beautiful. And one of the ways they have to maneuver that responsibility is by concealing their beauty and only showing their beauty to those who have the right to see their beauty, those who deserve it. Whereas today, of course, we're encouraged and we're conditioned to show our beauty to everyone and anyone. And it simply degrades. When you have too much of something, you don't appreciate it. And if you give everything that you have, no one will take anything that you have, because no one values it. Then he says, ويضع يديه على الأرض حذاء منكبيه ويفرج بين أصابعهما بل يضمهما ولا يفرج بين أصابعهما بل يضمهما ويضم الإبهام إليهما ولا يفترج ذراعيه على الأرض فإنه منهي عنه. So he says, when a person goes in sujood, he should have his hands placed at the position of his shoulders. So some of the fuqaha, they say that, and some they say his head should be in between his hands. So that hands on the floor and the head in between the hands, or hands on the floor, equivalent level to the shoulders. And he says he should not spread between the fingers, but he should bring them together. And again, there's a difference of opinion, depending on the madhab that you follow. No problem. Spread them, bring them together. For the sake of this lesson, we're not going into that. Whichever madhab you follow the madhab, alhamdulillah, no issue there. And he says, and this is something agreed upon, that he should not لا يفترش ذراعيه على الأرض فإنه منهي عنه, that he should not have his his arms, I forget what's this called, the forearm. He should not have his forearm placed on the ground. The forearm should be lifted. And sometimes they do that. They place the forearms on the ground. No, the forearm should be lifted, as it's prohibited. The Prophet ﷺ, he prohibited it. Then he says, وَيَقُولُ سُبْحَانَ رَبِّي الْأَعْلَى ثَلَاثًا ثُمَّ يَرْفَعُ مِنَ السُّجُودِ فَيَطْمَئِنُّ جَالِسًا مُعْتَدِلًا فَيَرْفَعُ رَأْسَهُ مُكَبِّرًا وَيَجْلِسُ عَلى رِجْلِهِ الْيُسْرَى وَيَنصِبُ قَدَمَهُ الْيُمْنَى وَيَضَعُ يَدَيْهِ عَلى فَخِذَيْهِ وَالْأَصَابِعَ مَنشُورَةً وَيَقُولُ رَبِّ اغْفِرْ لِي وَارْحَمْنِي وَارْزُقْنِي وَاهْدِنِي واجبرني وعافني واعف عني ويأتي بالسجدة الثانية كذلك. So basically he goes through the entire sujood, that he says Subhana Rabbi al-A'la 3 times, and then he gets up, he sits for a moment, and he mentions the dhikr, which he has here, رَبِّ اغْفِرْ لِي وَارْحَمْنِي وَارْزُقْنِي وَاهْدِنِي واجبرني وعافني واعف عني. And so a person can refer back to the books of fiqh, or al-Adhkar by Imam al-Nawawi, or Hisn al-Muslim, the Fortress of the Muslim, etc., and find these ad'iyah, and I would recommend doing so. Oh Allah, forgive me and have mercy upon me and provide for me and guide me and you know, basically entrench me upon guidance, and overlook my mistakes, and keep me safe and sound from harm. Saying that in between the sajdatain. Then he does the second sajda after doing this dua, just like he engaged in the first sajda. He says ثم يتشهد في الركعة الثانية التشهد الأول ثم يصلي على رسول الله عليه الصلاة والسلام ويضع يده اليمنى على فخذه اليمنى ويقبض أصابعه اليمنى إلا المسبحة ويشير بها وحدها عند قوله إلا الله لا عند قوله لا إله ويجلس في هذا التشهد كما بين السجدتين. So now he speaks about the first tashahhud, and I'm going to go through it briefly, as I'm sure everyone knows it. But he sits basically the way he would sit in between, and where you place your feet, how you place your feet. Again, there's a difference of opinion, so we're not going to go into it. But you place the hands on the thighs, and he says you only lift your finger when saying illallah, not la ilaha. So he would say la ilaha illallah, and that's the Hanafi opinion as well. ويجلس في هذا التشهد كما بين السجدتين وفي التشهد الأخير يستكمل الدعاء المأثورة بعد الصلاة على النبي عليه الصلاة والسلام. And so after sending salutations upon the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام, اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم, etc. Or اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد كما صليت على سيدنا إبراهيم, variations of the same dua. After this, the salah على النبي عليه الصلاة والسلام, you complete the tashahhud, and then you bring the salam. He says وسننه كسنن التشهد الأول لكن يجلس في الأخير على وركه الأيسر ويضجع رجله اليسرى خارجة من تحته وينصب اليمنى. ثم يقول السلام عليكم ورحمة الله ويلتفت يمينا بحيث يرى خده الأيمن من ورائه من الجانب الأيمن ويلتفت شمالا كذلك ويسلم تسليمة ثانية وينوي بالسلام الملائكة والمسلمين ويرفع صوته بالتكبيرات بقدر ما يسمع أو يسمع نفسه. So basically everything that I'm pretty sure we all know here, but the التحيات لله والصلوات الطيبات, and then السلام عليكم ورحمة الله, السلام عليكم ورحمة الله, and he says that a person turns to the right, and he turns to the right so much so that a person behind him will be able to see his right cheek. Then he turns to the left so much so that the person behind him will be able to see his left cheek. And he says when he is giving the salam, he intends to give salam to the angels and the Muslims. So the angels and the Muslims, when he says Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, to the angels and to the Muslims on both sides. And then he comes to al-Imam, and we'll conclude with the Imam next week, inshallah. So we'll stop there, bi-idhnillah.